this thing working? Right, so this week we had two celebrities die that, made the news, and I thought we'd talk about them because pretty influential when you look at what they've done. So we're going to talk about Michelle Trachtenberg and Gene Hackman, Lex Luthor himself. So when you hear the names, you hear Michelle Trachtenberg, what's the first role you think of? You think of Gossip Girls, you think of Harriet the Spy. Pretty sure we all think of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She didn't play Buffy, we know that. That was Sarah Michelle Gellar. I have a lot to say about Buffy. That belongs in at least 3 different videos. And then we have Gene Hackman. For me, growing up, it was Lex Luthor, it was Hoosiers. I don't know, he keeps popping up in weird places. Like, you'll be watching a movie and be like, that Gene Hackman? Really? But we're going to talk about The Birdcage, which also gets its own video at some point. In fact, that one's on my to-do list. So let's go. Let's talk about Michelle Trachtenberg, Gene Hackman. Before we go any further, make sure to click like and subscribe. That way you'll get to see more content like this. Also, to help other people find this content. You can also join my Patreon. There'll be links down below. And a reminder at the end of the video. For now, enjoy the rest of the video. Right, so I'm not going to make a video every time a celebrity dies. It's not that I don't care, it's that I want to talk about the ones that either influence me directly or that I think are just very influential. And so you might wonder how Michelle Trachtenberg made the list, people I would bother to make a video about. And you might think that Gene Hackman is obvious, but he's not. So let's start. I'm going to talk about Michelle Trachtenberg first. I think the role she's played that's the most famous is probably going to be Dawn from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. If you haven't seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer, let me tell you about Dawn. Now, the basic premise here is that Buffy, which, if you don't know, is actually a nickname for Elizabeth, is the vampire slayer. She kills supernatural monsters and stuff. It's a Monster of the Week kind of episode. There tends to be a season-long story arc. At the beginning of the series, she's an only child. In the season 5 premiere, in the very last scene of season 5, Dawn appears out of nowhere, and suddenly Buffy has a little sister. Now, it's worth talking about this as the trope. It's similar to Jumping the Shark, where if a show isn't doing so well, you make them have a baby, you bring in a new kid, and suddenly, breathes new life into the show, or it's supposed to anyway. This isn't that, actually. So if you haven't seen Buffy and you really want to watch it, this is the point where you stop, you go watch all of Buffy, all 7 seasons, and then you come back and watch the rest of the video. So the reason Dawn appears out of nowhere is because what's actually happened is a particular demon has escaped from an alternate dimension. She was locked up there, and these priests had the key, and they needed to hide the key somewhere, and they decided to hide it with the Slayer. And to make sure that the Slayer would protect it properly, they had to make it a blood relative, and that's how you get Dawn as a sister. She is also the key to everything, and as the story progresses, we find that in order to lock this demon back up, one of the sisters has to die, and very dramatically, at the very end of the season, Buffy sacrifices herself so that Dawn doesn't have to. So that's the basic story about Dawn. So why do I think she's so influential? Now, you got to keep in mind, in portraying a character, in order to create a character and put it on screen, there's a whole bunch of people involved. The actor tends to be close to the end of the chain of people who are involved. You've got writers and producers and have to put it together. You've got a director that has to figure out how they're going to shoot it, and then has to coach the actors in their performances, and then of course the actor has to embody the character. In this specific case, what the writers provided in the end was your stereotypical emo teenager, and this was at a time when you could say the emo culture was starting to develop, and you can have whatever prejudice about that you want, might even not like me using the word, but this is important. So what we see with Dawn is we see a child who's introduced to the show who was never intended. She just appeared out of nowhere. She's young, she's a little sister, she's trying to find her way in the world, figure out who she is like every teenager, and along the way she finds out she was never supposed to exist in the first place. And she finds out in the most traumatic way possible because Buffy figures it out, and Dawn overhears Buffy telling her mom that something has changed. Dawn wasn't supposed to be here. One of the things that Buffy was particularly good at was taking normal, standard teenage difficulties and challenges and growing up experiences and stuff, and putting a supernatural face on it, and then exploring those same challenges, but doing it in a supernatural context. So obviously that's what they did with Dawn. Dawn was basically your unplanned second child, and Buffy's having issues with it as they're both teenagers, and actually at this point in the series Buffy herself is like 19 or 20. So where Michelle Trachtenberg really did justice to this character is she gave us a believable character. She took a character that was built up out of stereotypes and gave us a real person. Real people struggle with these things. And it's not very often you see in a show a younger child being given a story like that. Usually, I mean, you see them getting basically what younger childs always get. I guess full disclosure, I'm the youngest in my family. I'm the youngest of four. Might be a little sympathetic here. But usually what you get is you get the older siblings are always picking on the younger ones, and it's usually played for laughs. But here you actually get an exploration of those feelings. And she appeared, when did Buffy premiere? Like 96, 95, 96, 97, somewhere in that range. So Dawn is showing up right before 9/11, basically. So the teenagers that are watching the show at that point, these are millennials. So you have a bunch of millennial girls watching this show being influenced and seeing their stories actually being told on screen. Their feelings are there. And for the first time, we get an entire generation of women that is more emotionally intelligent than anything that has ever come before. Maybe some men that watch the show, I don't know. I didn't watch it until I was in like my late 30s, early 40s. So when I was watching Buffy, I had the point of view of a parent watching a teenage drama. I got more, we'll get to that more in a minute. But so you have these, teenage girls that are actually seeing their stories, like the ones when I grew up watching. I grew up watching like Cheers, the Cosby Show, Different Strokes, Brady Bunch reruns, whatever. Star Trek. The Star Trek doesn't really tell kids stories. And the other teenage dramas of the time, I didn't really watch them. My wife at the time was really into Dawson's Creek for a little while, but I didn't watch it with her. And so this was a very unique presentation. And in the years since then, we've seen a much bigger push for not just mental health services, but just wellness in general. Like we now have a whole industry built up around wellness. Granted, a lot of it's crackpots, but a lot of it's integrated into psychiatric care. Because now we're understanding that we're not just talking about good mental health, we're talking about being well. Like, you get the flu, you get sick, and then after you recover from it, you're well. That's the kind of wellness we're talking about. And a lot of these millennial, I honestly don't know if it was mostly women that watched it at the time. I couldn't tell you about demographics, but I can tell you that every millennial woman I've dated was really into Buffy. They're all mothers now. I mean, they've had kids. They've been caring about their kids' mental health, and they're paying attention to their younger kids. And a lot of this is driving a revolution in mental health services. People are getting more care than they used to. They're understanding they need it. And I remember when I was watching that season, like in some of the early episodes, so I have a kid who, as a teenager, was having a lot of mental health struggles too. And she was going through them while we were watching this season. And I spent a lot of time admitting her into mental hospitals and stuff and picking her up from them and so forth. And so here I am watching Dawn's story playing out, and in some of the early episodes I was yelling at the screen. I was like, you guys need to listen to her. She's going to try to kill herself. And my wife at the time, who was my second wife, so she's not my kid's mother, she was telling me, you need to settle down. That's not going to happen. This is fine. And then there's a scene where Buffy opens the door and Dawn's all covered with blood because guess what she tried to do? And so when we're looking at Michelle Trachtenberg, who portrayed Dawn, she has had a huge, albeit indirect, influence on the world we live in now. She has made it better in ways we can't even measure right now. We don't know how many people in the last 25 years didn't kill themselves and instead went and got help because they identified with Dawn and they realized they needed help. I don't know if we can know that. So what does that have to do with Gene Hackman? Not a lot of direct connection between these two, except that Gene Hackman did something that has indirectly changed the world too. So when we mention Gene Hackman, what's the first role that comes to mind? You think about Lex Luthor, Hoosiers, those are the only two that I can really think of by name for the most part, except for one, which also deserves its own video and which is on my plan. I'm going to do one on the birdcage at some point. And when you look at the birdcage and you see there's an amazing amount of talent there. That is Homer Simpson, right? Definitely a lot of Simpsons voices. Anyway, of course, you got Robin Williams, Callista Flockhart, who a year after the birdcage would do Ally McBeal and apparently is married to Harrison Ford. Diane Wiest, I don't remember the guy who played the son. You got Nathan Lane in his first major performance. And while Nathan Lane wasn't openly gay at the time, professionally, people didn't look at Nathan Lane and think, oh, he's gay. And we know that. And he would go on Oprah and kind of dance around the subject. I think it still gets credit for putting an openly gay character or actor in a lead role, because we found out so soon after anyway that it kind of doesn't make a difference. And then you have Gene Hackman. Now, Gene Hackman in The Birdcage, if you haven't seen The Birdcage, what the hell is wrong with you? The Birdcage is a story about a gay couple. Okay, the main plot is the gay couple's son is going to marry a woman who is the daughter of a U.S. senator who started a moral majority kind of organization, and his partner in that organization was just caught, I think, found dead in bed with an underage black prostitute. Now, the movie was made in the 90s, so there's going to be some issues here. Like, we would look at that now and ask, if she was underage, Was she really a prostitute or was she being trafficked? The movie doesn't answer that question. So the senator needs to meet his family and get their approval for him to go public about the engagement as a way of rescuing his organization from scandal because of what his partner did. Problem is, he's a conservative senator, and the boy's parents are two gay men. And this is where all the comedy comes from. Well, a lot of the comedy comes from here. They tried to teach Nathan Lane's character how to behave like a man so he can pretend to be the uncle, to get in contact with his biological mother and get her to show up, and her and the father would pretend to be man and wife. It's based on it's a remake of a French farcical movie. And then in the end, it's all revealed. The conservative finds out everything. He's actually in an apartment that's on top of a drag club owned by the two gay parents of the man who's going to marry his daughter. And the paparazzi are out there, so they dress everybody up in drag and get them out through the club. And you get to see Gene Hackman in drag. It's awesome. And then there's a happy wedding at the end. Everybody's there. Why do I think this is really important? First of all, the influence of The Birdcage is huge. Technically, there were a couple of drag queen-oriented movies that came out right before that. One of them, I don't remember what it was called. The other one was Tu Wong Fu. Maybe you've seen that one. Wesley Snipes and a couple of other people. It's a wonderful movie. It's a road trip movie, though. The Birdcage is a family movie. And I believe it's the first time, at least in American media, that we really see a family with two gay parents depicted as a loving family. Now, it got some criticism at the time for relying too much on gay stereotypes. I would counter that with, they used the gay stereotypes to pull in mainstream audiences and then showed them a loving gay family. And with the whole farcical part, trying to pretend to be a straight family, they were able to compare and contrast and show us that, sure, if both of your parents are gay, your families, there are going to be some natural differences there, but at the heart of it, it's all the same. It's all family. Now, I read in an interview somewhere, and I tried to find it before I shot the video. I'll keep looking for it, but I'm shooting this on the day the news broke about Gene Hackman dying, and right now, if you try to Google anything about Gene Hackman, all you're going to find is a bunch of tributes to him. If I ever find it, I'll put a link down below. But I remember reading an interview with him where someone asked him what he thought his most important role was. And he answered with The Birdcage. Because you can draw a line from The Birdcage that does happen to go through Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all the way to the Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court decision that legalized gay marriage for everybody in the country, every state, everywhere. Now gay couples can have the privilege of fighting and getting divorced and having to fight over all their assets and child support and all that kind of stuff. Yes, that's supposed to be a joke. And in The Birdcage, they show us, because the marriage story is there between, Robin Williams and Nathan Lane's characters. They're always talking about palimony, which sounds silly now because palimony was a legal thing that gay couples had to do when they couldn't legally marry that would establish all of the same privileges and rights and stuff through a contract that still didn't have the same legal standing as actually being married. So there's a scene between Nathan Lane and Robin Williams where Nathan Lane is demanding the palimony and Robin Williams Nathan Lane is saying he's going to leave, he's not getting it. Robin Williams did this last year. Here you go. And he shows them the papers and says, we've already been married for a year or something like that. And it's really sweet. Very much a product of its time. Because now that scene would be a proposal. Why is Gene Hackman so important for this? He played a stereotypical senator, conservative senator, trying to save his ass after a scandal that would affect him, but he wasn't directly involved in. Why is he so important here? And the answer is because even though The Birdcage isn't one of those big movies that everybody in the world has seen, it is a movie that directly led, through its influence, to a lot more media. Within a year or so, we had Ellen coming out as gay, and that was big. We had the Willow and Tara story in Buffy, gay couple depicted there. And we have more acceptance of gay people in society and so forth. So why is Gene Hackman so important for all of this? Couldn't anybody have played that role? I mean, you could have put Harrison Ford, who would have met Callista Flockhart a little bit earlier. I'm not going to agree with that. Gene Hackman was immensely talented, and he took this stereotypical senator, and for 90% of the movie, yeah, you could have put anybody in that role for 90% of the movie. But for that last 10%, where he sees the gay family and realizes they're just family, and this is not going to be scandalous for him, and he is going to stand up for his daughter. Only Gene Hackman could have pulled that off. And while you look, and I mean, the stars are Robin Williams and Nathan Lane. They're the headliners. They're the ones carrying the whole movie. But if you ask, who's the most important part of the cast, it's kind of hard to pick because it's an ensemble cast. But I don't think that movie would have been as influential as it was without Gene Hackman. So I'm really grateful Gene Hackman was in that movie. It's made a lot of people's lives better. So I guess this is the part where I'm supposed to point out that our current president is doing blah, and all of this blah stuff is happening. And I just want to remind you, these particular pieces of media I'm talking about are over 25 years old. Wow, Buffy went for 7 seasons and went into the odds. So 22 years for the last episode. We've had a whole generation grow up since then, with another whole generation coming up. And my generation, Generation X, we were watching it too. You cannot erase the changes that have been made. So I'm not too worried about current president, because this is progress that will not be erased. I guess we'll close this out with a little rest in peace for Michelle Trachtenberg and Gene Hackman, and some gratitude for what they have given the world.